right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, what we did yesterday, you learned how to calculate the value of C and then write that as a binomial square. We're combining that step with the square root method, which we did last week, okay? So putting the two things together. And we can solve any equation by completing the square, which is kind of nice. It works all the time. So first of all, how do you figure out C? C equals half of what? In this case, it's 16. What would it be generically? Half of B, quantity squared. Yeah. We talked about AX squared plus BX plus C. B is the number in front of the X term. And so this is how we calculate C generically. For this particular problem, C would be half of what? Half of 16, yeah, quantity squared, the number in front of X. What is half of 16? 8. And what is 8 squared? 64. So today, finding that C value was what I was asking for. C equals 64, okay? So we are combining what we did yesterday and completing the square, or not, and the square root method, and that's how we end up solving by completing the square. So kind of nice. There are lots of steps today to completing the square, but once you do it enough, you can skip a lot of the steps. So hopefully you'll figure that out. Okay. I show all my steps for you guys, but I can complete the square in about 3 steps. Well, 4. Not 4. 3 or 4. Solve by completing the square. All right, we have solved by completing the square. Give me a second to write that down. Solve by completing the square. We have x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. All right. Our very first step that we're going to do, on the side of your paper, you might want to write down the steps that I'm going to smush in up here. You want to isolate the x squared and x term. The first step is to isolate the x squared and the x term. You should definitely create a little list of steps here, ladies and gentlemen, just to guide your process. Isolate the x squared and the x term. Well, right here is my x squared and my x term. I want those 2 terms alone. So what do I need to get rid of? The 8. How do we move it away? Subtract the 8. Subtract the 8. Good. So I'm going to leave a little bit of extra space here. X squared plus 6x, give yourself some room, is equal to negative 8. Then our second step is to add C to both sides of the equation, both sides of the equals. And remember, C equals 1/2 of B quantity squared. We're going to add C to both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and add that C to both sides. Yesterday, we only had one side of the equation. How come I have to put the C on both sides? What happens to an equation if I only add C to the left side of the equation? It's unbalanced now. We just added 8 pounds of weights to the left, and our balance is now askew. All right? So we have to add C to both sides because we want to keep our equation balanced. So I'm going to figure out what C is. We're going to go ahead and find out. It's 1/2 of, what's our B value? 6. 1/2 of 6, quantity squared. What's half of 6? 3. And what is 3 squared? 9. So we figured out our C, and we're going to go ahead and plug it back into our equation. So we have x squared plus 6x plus 9 equals negative 8 plus 9. So we're putting that value for C back into our equation. Now, yesterday, after we figured out what C was, what do we do on the left-hand side here? What do we do with the trinomial? Factor it. Yeah, the whole reason for completing the square is that now you can factor your trinomial that you created. So the third step is to factor your trinomial. So we added that value to create something really great here on that left-hand side. I can double bubble. What is, or how do we get x squared? What times what is x squared? X times x. And what times what is positive 9? 3 and 3. Positive 3 and positive 3. It's always that number right there. And I can condense that into what? X plus 3 quantity squared. Hopefully you can jump right to that step. That'd be nice, right? So it factors, and so we get x plus 3 quantity squared equals, can we maybe combine this left-hand side? What is negative 8 plus 9? Positive 1. That's completing the square. You learned all of this yesterday. Okay? Now we're going to solve. So the very last step is to solve using the square root method. So we're going to solve by taking the plus or minus the square root of both sides. Right? Solve by using the square root method. Solve plus or minus the square root. So again, I'm trying to solve for x. So how do I get rid of the squared? Square root, absolutely. We're going to square root both sides. Don't forget the big old plus or minus. That's huge. My square root and my square cancel out, leaving what? X plus 3 equals big plus or minus. What is the square root of 1? 1. No more radical. That's kind of nice. And how do you get x by itself? Subtract 3. So we're going to move it over. So we get x equals negative 3 plus or minus 1. This equation doesn't have any radicals in it. All right? If it had a radical, you're done. All right? But it doesn't have any radicals, which means I get to go one more step. Because these are just numbers. I can figure out what these numbers are. Negative 3 plus 1 gives me negative 2. And then negative 3 minus 1 gives me negative 4. So there are two solutions for x here. X equals negative 2 and negative 4. So these are my two answers for x. Negative 2 and negative 4. So when there's no more radicals, you got to go the one extra step to actually figure out the number. All right, letter B, we've got x squared equals 4x minus 13. This one's in a different order. What do we need to do? Subtract 4x, because we want the x squared and that x term on the same side. So I'm going to move it over and give myself some room here. So I want my x squared and my x term on the same side. And then what's the second step? Add c to both sides. We're going to figure out what c is. It's going to be half of what? Half of negative 4 quantity squared. What is half of negative 4? Negative 2. And what is negative 2 times negative 2? Positive 4. And now we found c. I'm going to go ahead and plug it right back in to my little c value there. So x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals negative 13 plus 4. So plugging that number for C in. What does that allow me to do? Factor. Very good. So this left-hand side factors. How does it factor? How does it factor? X minus 2 and x minus 2, which I could write as x minus 2 quantity squared. It's always that number right there. X minus 2 quantity squared. All right. Can I do that? Just jump right to that? Sure. Can you do that? Sure. Maybe having the little bubbles there is helpful, but... Oh, you know what? He's absent. He's not here right now. All right. And then we can also combine that right-hand side. What is negative 13 plus 4? Negative 9. All right, that was completing the square. How do you solve? Square root both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. My square root and my square cancel out, leaving x minus 2 equals plus or minus. How do we simplify the radical? How do we simplify radical negative 9? Good. I'm hearing plus or minus 3 i's in hushed tones. All right. The square root, remember the square root of negative 1 equals I. So here that little square root of a negative gives me an I. And then the square root of 9 is 3. So we get plus or minus 3i. The square root of 9 is 3. So that radical simplified nicely. How do we get x by itself? Add the 2. Add the 2. So we get x equals 2 plus or minus 3i. Can I put the 2 and 3 together to get 5? No. All right, the 2 is a real number. The 3 is imaginary. 3i, it's imaginary. They can't combine, so just stay like that. 2 perfect answers. 2 perfect imaginary answers. All right, questions so far? What do you think of this? It's long, but it's fine, right? You've done everything we need to know to do all these steps. 2 more and then we're done. X squared minus x equals 1. You have a double-sided worksheet today, but we're only doing the front of it today. And then tomorrow you do the back side. Okay? The back side has an extra step in there. All right, what is our very first step for completing the square? Isolating the x squared and x term. That's already been done. So what do I need to do then? Add c. Very good. So we have x squared minus x plus a c value equals 1 plus the c value. How do we figure out c? Half of, what's the b value? Negative 1. Very good. There's that negative 1 there. Half of negative 1 quantity squared. You can think about that as negative 1 over 1 if you want, and then we just get to multiply straight across. 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. 2 times 1 is 2. And it's quantity squared. What is negative 1/2 quantity squared? 1/4. Very good. Negative 1/2 times negative 1/2, again, multiplying straight across, is positive 1/4. So there's our c value. What are we going to do with that c value? Plug it in place of c. Put it back in your equation. So we have x squared minus 1x plus 1/4 equals 1 plus 1/4. And then we can double bubble or factor that trinomial. X times x is x squared. What times what is positive 1/4? It's right there, always, always, always. -1/2 and -1/2. It's sort of why I like writing out the C, because it gives you an answer later. Okay? -1/2 times -1/2 is positive 1/4, and 1/2 creates a whole. So we can write that as x minus 1/2 quantity squared. Now, on the right-hand side, 1 plus 1/4, maybe you don't like fractions. So guess what? Your calculator can do that. 1 plus 1/4 is, hopefully you know the answer, 1.25. But I want it as a fraction. Fractions are always going to be easier for you. So we want math frac. Use your calculator. You'll have a button that's going to tell you what the fraction is. Okay, so convert it to a fraction, and we get 5/4. Use your calculators whenever you need to. That's why you're allowed to use them. So 5/4. Really, 4/4 plus 1/4 is 5/4. All right. And then how do we solve for x? Square root. Get rid of the power. We're going to do a square root. The square root and the square cancel out, leaving x minus 1/2 equals plus or minus. How do you simplify a radical when it's got a fraction inside? Separate it into the square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. Separate that radical into two little radicals. Can I do anything with 5? No, he is prime. He stays under the radical. Can I simplify the square root of 4? What is the square root of 4? 2. And then how do you get x by itself? Add 1/2. Add a half. So we get adding the half plus or minus radical 5 over 2. Move that 1/2 by addition, and there are our two lovely answers. 1/2 plus radical 5 over 2 and 1/2 minus radical 5 over 2. Okay. Can I add the 1 and the 5, radical 5 together? No. One's a totally regular number and one's got a radical. All right, last one, ladies and gentlemen. What's our very first step? Add 7. Isolate your x squared and x term, and to do that, we need to add 7. So x squared plus 3x equals 7, and then we can add some c values in. I need to figure out what that value is. How do we find c? One half of 3. Half of 3 quantity squared. Half of 3 quantity squared. How do you multiply 1/2 times 3? Put it over 1 and go straight across. 1 times 3 is 3. 2 times 1 is 2. And we want to square that. What is 3/2 quantity squared? 9/4. Yeah, 3/2 times 3/2. 3 times 3 is 9. 2 times 2 is 4. So we get 9/4 for our value. And I'm going to plug right back into my equation. X squared plus 3x plus 9/4 equals 7 plus 9/4. On the left-hand side, how does it factor? X times x is x squared. What times what gives you 9/4? Yeah, right there, 3/2 and 3/2. Positive 3/2 times positive 3/2. Again, if you wanted to double bubble it, you could, or you could just write it as the squared term. Over here, 7 plus 9/4 seems complicated, so I'm just going to use my calculator and do 7 plus 9/4. And I get 9.25, which then I'm going to math frac, which is 37/4. 37/4. How do I solve? Square root both sides. Don't forget the plus or minus. Square root and the square cancel out. I know you're anxious to get done. So am I. So here we go. Plus or minus. Again, giant radical. We split up into two little guys. Can I do anything with radical 37? No, there's no perfect squares in there, so we get radical 37. Square root of 4 is 2. And then I'm going to move my 3/2 over. How do I move it? Subtract it. So it becomes negative 3/2 plus or minus radical 37 over 2. So ladies and gentlemen, when I do this, I do this step. That's my first step. And then I do this step. And then it's these 4 steps that I do when I complete the square. Okay. And some of this, like all this I can do in my brain. You might need to write it down. But. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Again, you have class practice 53, but today we're only doing numbers 1 through 12. Okay? Just the front.